Hello and welcome back to Impact, the show that's all about making an impact on the community and the world through the community. I'm Heidi Phillipson.
And I'm Nick Barber.
And on today's show, our number 4 show, Nick, by the way.
4 shows, wow. We're rolling right along, aren't we?
We are.
It's
We're
going
still
well.
looking for your emails, so please feel free to email us at impact@proctors.org.
We'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely, we'll be checking the inbox. And then today, let's start off the show. Let's get into it right away, Nick. We've got Philip Morris, of course.
Philip Morris.
And as usual, he's got a great guest. Mm-hmm. We're looking at David Carroll.
David Carroll is the new executive director of the Albany Institute of History and Art.
And he's got a lot of interesting things to say, especially considering what he did come from and now what he's working on. So I'm not going to tell you because I like putting out those little puzzling tidbits and I want you to watch the show. You watch it and hey, we'll have to get some kind of quiz going on and see if we can get them to participate in the quizzes if they watch the show.
We could do that.
In any case, stay tuned and we'll see you soon.
Welcome to this segment of Impact. I'm Philip Morris, CEO of Proctors and the interviewer for the Arts segment. Today our guest is David Carroll, the relatively new, actually very new, Executive Director of the Albany Institute of History and Art. Welcome, David. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've come from a very interesting place, the Western
Museum of Mining and Industry.
Mining and Industry. I mean, as an Easterner, you look at that and go, what the hell is that about? But it's pretty amazing, right? Tell us for a minute.
The museum was started in 1970 by a collector that had collected mining artifacts for many years, and his family came to him one day and said, "Dad, what are you going to do with all this stuff you've been collecting?" And so he decided to start a museum. He first actually offered it to the Smithsonian, and they said, "Sure, we would love your collection, but we got to tell you, most of it's going to be in storage." And he thought, that's not what I want. I want to have this out for the public to see. And so he bought 42 acres of land in Colorado Springs, built a museum on top of that, and took most of his collection and gave it to the museum.
So what's in a collection? Give me 8 examples.
Well, the main piece in the museum was a 1895 steam engine. It was 37 tons. It was the most efficient steam engine that was ever built. So we had a lot of steam engines in the museum that ran, and as well as little small artifacts like mining lamps and mining candles and the helmets and the various things. And so the history of mining in the West is really the history of the West. Why so many people were coming out to the West was to get rich, to find those minerals, the gold, the silver, the copper. And so that's really what we talked about, is how mining at that museum, how mining influenced how the West is developed and how it is today.
So what brought you to be a coaster?
A coaster.
An East Coaster.
East Coaster, yeah. Well, really the Albany Institute of History and Art. I really enjoyed, what I find so fascinating about that museum, and this comes from some early influences that I had when I was going through my career, is the idea that they have the art and the historical objects. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I learned early on is that art, or even the creation of objects, don't happen in a vacuum. And it's so when they come together that story becomes much richer. And so you can look at the art and you can look at the objects and build the bigger story. I'll give you a great example is the current exhibit we have going on right now. It's First in the Heart of his Countrymen. It looks at the iconic image of George Washington and how over time that has changed and developed. But we reference that in not only images that would be considered art, but also objects that are used to that have his image on top of that. And through that, as you walk through those galleries, you get the story of how George Washington's image, his likeness, has been used almost to brand America. And at the very end, you have one of the interesting parts. You have a Time magazine article that on the cover of Time magazine, they use George Washington's face with a black eye to talk about the financial crisis. And so that iconic image is still used
licensed
today.
character, right?
Absolutely,
Exactly.
absolutely.
It's the Smurf of America.
Sure.
Well, you talk a little bit more about objects. You know, I think people think of museums and staid, you know, they think that they're boring and, you know, and somebody's in the basement with little glasses on and no light and, you know, and checking every little piece of paper.
Sure.
I mean, what
There is a little bit of that. But I think what museums are trying to do today, and there was probably more of the just a couple objects in a gallery and people were supposed to come and understand that. But I think what museums are trying to do more today is tell the larger story. That's what I think is so fascinating about when we study history. From my opinion, we study history in part to find identity, who we are, where we came from. Just looking at our own family trees is a great example of why we study that, to understand it. We study history to understand change, how times have changed in the past, and that change is part of the way we live. That change has happened in the past and it's going to happen in the future. And we also study history to understand empathy, the empathy of other people, other cultures. And so I think when you look at those kind of elements and you put objects within a gallery, you're trying to tell some of those stories. And I think that's where the object can be so powerful. As we look back, we understand more about who we are and maybe where we're going.
I was a history major in my undergraduate life, and the class that sort of opened my eyes was historiography, which is the study of the history of history, and
sure.
the notion that it's his story, that in fact you're learning as much about the storyteller as about the story that the teller is telling,
Sure.
which is much like your George Washington example.
Exactly.
What do the storytellers do with this material and image and stuff in order to recast, to recreate? What's the best stories that are in the basement of the Albany Institute?
Yeah, well, I would have to say I'm probably a little too new to answer that question for you right now. But I've seen some great, started to see some great things. One is the ovens or the fireplaces that we have that are part of that collection. But there's a whole wealth.
Fireplaces from homes or from industry?
From homes that have been created identical. Were started right here in Albany. Again, part of Albany's identity. And yet I haven't spent that much time. I think I'm on week 6 right now, so I'm still learning a lot about the Institute and its collection. But there's just fascinating objects, and with each one of those is a fascinating story.
So I've known you enough, we visited enough, that I have a sense of your desire to impact your world. Why museums? What about that makes you feel powerful, strong, that you can have an impact?
Sure. I think museums allow the community to continue that curiosity beyond whatever level of, beyond primary school, graduate school, any of those things. That when we do our jobs well, we're bringing the community in to have that dialogue about who we are. And it's that exciting part for me, whether you're a young K through 12 child or an older retiree that's looking to learn more about the community we live in or other communities. And I think it's that continuum from very young to very old that allows museum to be so important and have an impact within the community they're at.
What's your sense about museums being more proactive than that, being more political with a small p, activist?
I'm not a big fan of being real activists. I think as long as your story fits within has some scholarship, you allow the viewer, you respect the intelligence of the visitor to come in and understand the story, maybe question the story, be critical of the story, but it's that dialogue as well that I think museums can play an impact. I'll give you one example that from the Western Museum of Mining and Industry. We were talking about, this was long before Japan, but we were talking about uranium mining in Colorado. So we had a large exhibit about the history of uranium mining. And there is a large amount of uranium in the southwest part of Colorado. And at the time, there was a lot of talk of mining that uranium out finding it maybe as a cleaner source of energy than coal or some others. It has its problems. But through the exhibit, through the programming that we had, I thought that we had a really good dialogue among our community, the people in our community and our visitors, to kind of spark some dialogue amongst themselves and with us on, is that the right direction we want to go? So we kind of were fodder for that
Conversation rather than
conversation.
taking a position about that.
Absolutely.
Conversation.
And letting people then have a richer and deeper conversation because they're coming at it with more information.
Is there a role for the Institute around a subject like fracking, which of course is a huge political
Big
subject?
issues. I really think that as we expand our audiences, we're going to have to look at partnerships. And not just the typical partnerships between arts organizations, but partnerships with all kinds of organizations, clubs, geological clubs, and science clubs.
Mm-hmm.
And as we look at that, because again, the art and the objects, I really believe, don't happen in these vacuums. They're all part of the bigger dialogue. And so as we have that, possibly there's some kind of communication that we can have along those ways.
I mean, it can be charged, but without taking a position, it becomes education.
You just kind of have that dialogue and show where things are happening, and respect the intelligence of the visitor, let them make their own decisions, but help that dialogue along.
Terrific. Thank you very much, David. I look
You bet.
forward to working with you for many years.
Great.
That's David Carroll from the Albany Institute of History and Art. I'm Philip Morris. Thank you for joining Impact.